Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm applause to two of our guests. Would you please come to the stage, Navi Pillay, lawyer and activist from South Africa for human rights, president for the International Tribunal for Rwanda, judge in the International Criminal Court at The Hague, and the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Yeah. And to join her, of course, because no fight can be done alone, I'd also like to welcome Morten Kjaerum, director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. He was the first director of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights and chair of the board for the European Council of Refugees and Exiles. Excellent. We can see everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you both here. I've had a chance to speak with you, I think we can agree that the discussion that we have here is really an ongoing discussion. It is a global discussion. It is a discussion having both privately as well as locally and globally. We also know that civil rights, human rights, are a lifetime work. My first question for you both then, how can we use the language or practice of civil rights to combat racism in our everyday life? Can I start with you, Navi? Thank you.
Thank you. So, I'm sorry I can't speak Swedish, but I know the word tax for thank you. So, thank you for being here in such a big number. As Josette said, I was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, so I urge you to keep the international perspective in mind. Sweden is a foremost role player for many years in the United Nations. So is the European Union. And you are all aware of the framework that has been established and the tremendous progress that the United Nations has made for the protection and promotion of human rights and for good policies and good decisions and action plans. These are familiar to you, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is all rights for all people all over the world. It doesn't say all rights except for women, except for migrants, except for black people. It says all. So that's the starting point of the international standard. Then you know that there are two major covenants, civil and political rights, economic and social rights. These are available to all people within the jurisdiction of a state, not just citizens. So I know that migrants is a very hot issue, so it is in my own country, in South Africa just now, because the locals are presumably attacking foreign nationals of African origin, and everybody's shocked about this. We have a good constitution, why are we going backwards? Back to the framework then, there are 10 treaties, Sweden has signed up to all of them. Sweden then taught us human rights. Sweden helped Africa to build towards human rights protection. And so it's very, very important that you don't slide backwards, because if you do, the whole of Africa is very likely to follow suit, because they just have developed, they're there with protections. So this is a very important and significant reason why you have to use the international human rights instruments and tools to advance human rights here.
And that you mean to use it verbally, to use it on paper, to be able to use it in everyday situations, to be able to study it, to be able to quote it, to be able to use it as a living document, a living law. Do you yourself, Morten, have a response to the question? The everyday.
Absolutely. And first of all, I really want to congratulate the organizers with this fantastic event. It's so great to be here today, and of course also now being part of the Swedish landscape. So thanks a lot to all the organizers. But definitely, I think fundamental rights, human rights, is key in the fight against racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc., etc. Because it creates the framework for the very dialogue between all of us. I mean, that is the lowest common denominator. These are the values that we actually base the global dialogue between all groups, between people upon. And that is why it's so crucial constantly to insist on a human rights compliance and the importance. If we cannot agree on the fundamental rights, on the human rights, then we can agree on very little. So it is a global outset coming back to the universality of human rights. So that's one element. The other element, which is unique about human rights, that is that human rights, what is it all about? It's about putting the person at the center, at the core of our attention. I think a lot of us first really realized it with the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We stopped talking about a disabled person. You are your disability. No, we talked about a person with a disability. Yes. It's the same now with the refugees coming. We should talk about a person with a need of protection, not a refugee, not a categorization. Let's not forget that all, so to say, us and them dichotomies, all the fights starts by a categorization. We categorize the other person, then it's very handy. Then they're there and we are here. And that is exactly what human rights is all about. No, the person first, and then all the other elements, sexual orientation, ethnicity, skin color, whatever, can then come second, third. What is crucial here is that we always fight this singular identity. I mean, the urge to define the other person in terms of his or her nationality, religion, sexual orientation, etc. That we actually define the person as a person with all his or her complexities. I mean, I would hate if you only saw me as a white man. Full stop. Then we know everything about Morten. No, you don't know everything about me. I'm so much more than being a man, being a Dane, and probably a culture Christian as well. I mean, there's so much more to me. And I want you to respect that as well as I want to respect others the same way.
So what I'm understanding...
So that's basically why human rights, what human rights brings to the whole fight against racism.
And also what you make very clear, of course, is the global, national, local connection by using human rights. You are therefore not isolated, you are therefore not alone. You have examples, you have references, you have historical legislation to give to whatever situation, more or less, that you're in. You have backup. And as you say, humans, people are placed first and center, and that is a core issue to come back to.
It creates a common language to address the issue.
Absolutely. We have a possibility of how we might use the human rights, how we might use both document, ideology, ideas. But I'd wanted to shift the conversation and ask a very mundane, very simple question. It's something that I am experiencing myself as the everyday citizen, not people who are connected to organizations or associations or governments, local or otherwise, but the everyday person who understands, sees something, reacts to something in their life. How do you navigate fear? What is the fear, let me be specific, of being attacked, of being abused, of being mobbed on the internet? And some people might say, well, that's nothing to be afraid of, but for the everyday person, it is something that they have to overcome. So my question, starting with Morten, how, he's like, whoa, no, yes. How, what advice, what do you do? Maybe that's a better way to navigate fear.
Let me first underscore the importance of your question. I'm sure you don't doubt, but and that is at the EU Fundamental Rights Agency that I was so lucky to head for some 7 years. We made a number of surveys, actually asking not the majority, what do you think about this or that minority? That's very often the way you do it. No, we asked the minority, what is your experience? What are your anxieties? And what are your fears? And there in particular, 2 surveys stood out very clearly. That was the one on LGBT, so sexual minorities. And here we saw that across Europe, including liberal Sweden, Denmark, and other liberal countries, 2/3 of the respondents, and that was more than 100,000, told us that they didn't dare to hold hands in the street. A very common thing to do. Why? Because of the fear. Another survey on anti-Semitism, where we interviewed Jews across Europe. And here, in 3 countries, around 50% of the respondents told us that they had seriously considered to leave the country because of the security situation, because they didn't feel safe, because of fear. So fear is a real driver for the minorities as well as for the majorities, for the majority population. And that is where, so to say, the fear towards each other is very much the beginning of it, and something we need to address. And I would say a little bit like the speakers this morning said, I mean, brains are like books. They're best if they're open. And I think it's as simple as that. We need to be open to the others. If we don't want to listen, if we don't want to sort of try, if we are not curious about the other person, then the fear, the aggression can come up. It's striking to see in some of the elections where the immigration issue come up in Europe. In those areas where there are least migration, where there's very homogeneous population, are very often the regions where you have the highest score for the parties who are speaking out against immigrants and the other. So that fear factor is very dominant. So what can we do? I mean, I would say again, coming back to my books, they're best if they're open. Let's be open to the other. We need to meet. We need to create space where people can actually interact and actually, again, coming back to what I said before, coming back to the person, meeting the person, explore the person.
Absolutely, and I think one of the reasons I bring it up, of course, because certainly in Sweden at the moment we are going through, I would call, extraordinary changes, extraordinary transformations when it comes to the issue of identity, race, when it comes to the mobilization, the integration of the, certainly the movement towards this country will transform itself. It is no longer a white homogene. It is changing into something else, which I personally believe would be for the positive. And fear is part of that. And that's why, even though it seems like a simple question, there are people who are afraid, sitting in positions every day dealing with stuff they don't quite know. But one of the things that I have used myself is also to know your history. This has helped me to be able to understand not only what has gone before, but also what is possible. And I wanted to move to you, Navi. Of course, being based in South Africa, living there, you've come across extraordinary changes. And I wanted to ask you, probably both of you, history. And I know you've heard it before. How important is it to know your history, and what do we do about history getting rewritten?
Well, history and life experience is very important, but I want to address the fear issue as well.
Please do.
Because we need civil society more than ever before to be thoroughly aware and alert and to share the information with young people. So I agree with everything that Morten said. But let me say this to you. Who exactly out there, for political reasons or their own agenda, is exploiting the fear issue, spreading this stereotyping of people, the suspicion of the other? As High Commissioner, I traveled to 79 different countries, and I've heard people say we all lived harmoniously before. In Uganda, what's the issue about homosexuals? We tolerated them all the time. So who, for political reasons, is exploiting this to engender this fear? It happened in Rwanda, where the Tutsis and Hutu lived together. There was intermarriage, and suddenly the Hutus turned around and killed 800,000 Tutsis. Now, that didn't just happen.
No.
It happened because of the propaganda. Who did the United Nations Tribunal put on trial? The Prime Minister, all the ministers, the Minister of Defense. And I sat in these trials, and we sent to prison for life the head of the radio station and the editor of a journal because of the propaganda, the hate propaganda that they spread, which caused the death of 800,000 people. So I do appeal to you to examine, why is it I'm afraid? Somebody has suddenly made me afraid of racism and of immigration because they're counting on your votes for the next election. This is happening in very many countries. So unfortunately, the migrant issue is being exploited for political purposes. Now, back to history. Sweden helped us end apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was institutionalized racism, and I was a victim, so I know. I never thought we will see democracy in our country. And of course, you lost a prime minister because of his support for our struggle against racism. And that's your history. Don't ever forget it. We look up to you because you helped other people in other countries. When Nelson Mandela, as president, paid his first visit to Sweden, he said, the choice you made is so good. You chose human rights. And that should be the message. The choice you make, born out of your history about never again. Europe has been through 2 world wars. You've been through Nazism, and that started in small places, Nazism. How could this movement have spread and dumbed the minds of the majority populations in the whole of Europe so that they supported that level of racism? And it's something we have to watch out for consistently. So let me say, not only your own history provides you with tools, but what has happened in the international community is something I would never have believed would happen. It is that the member states review the human rights record of every country. It's called the Universal Periodic Review. So do look at that, the recommendations made by various states. Almost every one of them addresses racism. And then there was the Durban Conference on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and related intolerances. And many states have developed action plans on this. It's important that civil society is consulted in those action plans, that you have a say in the policies. I was very interested to learn about the embedding of human rights in local and provincial government here. So I would say civil society does have the answers. And now through social media, they're asking many questions. You have to, I say to governments all over the world, you have to work very closely with civil society. I recently chaired an investigation into why South Africans are killing African foreign nationals, they call them. And as we did a 6-month investigation, we found, no, this was triggered by some local businessmen who issued leaflets asking for these Somali spaza shop businessmen to be removed. You see where it starts? It's not the inherent racism, ethnic division, or discrimination by ordinary people. And I said in speeches to South Africa, we see on our television screens ordinary Germans welcoming the asylum seekers and refugees. The importance of human rights then as your tool is you are the rights bearers. You have the rights. And who has the obligation to deliver that right? Our governments. So this is not a question of charity. We'll save 50,000 women from dying while giving birth. No, it's everyone has a right, and the government has an obligation to deliver that. So that is our strength, and of course, rule of law, which you highly respect here in Sweden. It doesn't happen in very many places where people, just for criticizing their government or raising the race issue, or even sending a blog. I know a blogger in Vietnam who's serving 18 years imprisonment for a criticism he made, which you and I can get away with. Your voice is very important to help all those human rights defenders in their country who cannot speak, who get imprisoned if they speak.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
No, thank you. I'd like to hand over to Morten. I just wanted to know your response about history and retelling the story. I think for all of us who are going to be working, continuing to work, believe in the work of human rights and civil rights, one of the things, of course, is understanding our history in order to learn, but also discovering what is the truth and what is not the truth. So your response to that, again, how important is it to know your own history, and how can we detect the truth or not?
There's no doubt that history is crucial to understanding where do we come from as a nation. And the more I work with it, the more I really understand the importance of, let's say, telling the stories up through generations and the impact of the non-told stories. So my outset would basically be, let's scrap all the existing history books, because they're basically just telling us all why we're such a beautiful nation today. Then okay, we may have lost a few wars and etc. But basically, it's building the nation. That's what they're for. They are not for the difficult discussions. When did you last read in a history book in anywhere in Europe, including in Europe, why European countries got so Nazified in the 30s and the 40s? Why was it so easy? It's totally overlooked. It's not being discussed, and it's those. That part of history that can bring us on, not only the glorious wars that we won, but definitely much more also the bad side of our, let's say, you could almost say our national characters or whatever we sort of believe in this context. So why was it that it went so wrong in the 20s and the 30s, which could lead to that horrendous situation that we saw, Holocaust and the war in the etc. This is where we learn. Why in Denmark, my own country, do we not talk about that we were the 6th biggest slave nation in the world, just following the United States of America? We were very big in that one. There's not a place of memory on that. We don't talk about it. Why not? If you ask people at the West Indies, some of the Danish colonies, they say it have a tremendous impact today that they do not have that recognition, you could almost say, from the Danish population. Not an apology from the prime minister, but basically that there is a stronger dialogue between the two geographic entities, Denmark and the West Indies, but also a historical dialogue. Initially, when I started that dialogue with the West Indies, I didn't say, oh, come on, let's move on, sort of a classical Nordic approach. But the more I worked with them, the more I understood it. Having lived now in Austria for very many years, where there's a tremendous lid on the history, I see what the lack of discourse, the lack of discussion and recognition of these historical situations. Of course, in Austria, it was about the Nazification of the country. So we need to have, history is important, but we need to tell it in a different way than we do it today. Today, it creates more us and them dichotomies, conflicts, than it actually creates that, you could say, learning process.
And I have to say here.
Do, feel free. We're running like this because of the time, so yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I have to say, if you ask this question about history to people in Africa and Asia, the colonized people, they will tell you that it's a white man who introduced racism into Africa and Asia. Not you, but the colonizers here. So that's our history. We're victims of something that was introduced into our continent, and we're still suffering under the yoke of this kind of racial discrimination.
And also it's very important, as we're aware in Sweden, we really, really have the struggle now with discovering our own history. How we are treating the First Nation persons from the Sami. What's been happening. Thank you. What's happening there, and how we are struggling within school systems and political systems to even bring that information to light. The eugenics history that we have in Sweden, and our relationship to First and Second World War. I mean, this information we still struggle with to try to bring to light. And of course, Sweden's history in terms of slavery. There's still the ownership of slave castles that exist both in the West Indies and in the African continent. They are here, and what we are trying to do, and many of the civil organizations are bringing that information to light. What you make very clear is that without your history, your argument, your dialogue, without your personal research, human rights, using the legislation, your argument, your strategies, and your vision and energy run out. You have nothing to stand on. You have nothing to work against. You have nothing to argue. You have nothing to... Yeah. I'm very aware of the time. There's a coffee break, and as I said, I really believe that this is just a platform on which you stand and in which you go into the rest of the days. But I've got a last question, of course. The vision that we are working towards, the society that we want, will come. It is ours. It is ours for the taking, and as you have both repeated, our time has come. Maybe more than ever, and maybe it will become even more in the future, but it has come. Could you give us, in 3 minutes, when we get that place, when we get that world, when we have that society, what will it look like? What will it look like when we get what we want? Morten?
It's a hard one, but let me just go back a little bit,
Yeah.
just not in history, but basically saying, if there are 3 cities that have meant a lot for me in my life, then it's London, Berlin, and Istanbul. What is it with those 3 cities? That is that enormously dynamic interaction between all sorts of different cultures and people from east, north, south, west, etc. And they have found a modus vivendi. We also have examples where it has gone terribly wrong. I will not mention those. But in these 3 cities that some of us love a lot and take a lot of inspiration from, I see that as a bit of a future scenario. That how do we capture, like these cities, that dynamic and actually get something very constructive and forward-moving out of it. So an inclusive society, an open society where there's room for everybody, and then within a human rights framework. That we have that human rights framework, which is in a way the common denominator for our coexistence. If we have to agree on that. And it's so nice that we have the standards that Navi outlined so brilliantly as the framework. So
absolutely.
That would be my image.
We must carry it. We must have a shared vision of what it is going to be, because it will come. Last word to Your Highness.
Well, it's a living experience for me, because for almost 30 years I was a lawyer, and of course before that I was born a child of apartheid. So we experience racism at its worst, and we're enjoying non-racialism. So that's one story. Change is possible with the collective action of everyone. Exactly as cigarette smoking has been prohibited, but I see a lot of smoking going on here in Sweden here. So we still have work to do on that, but collective action of everyone is very important. Clearly, I would like to see a society like we have in South Africa now, but it's still a work in progress, because you have to still educate people to do what? To respect the other person, to respect diversity as enriching our culture, to respect migrant workers as people of value who are contributing. So in other words, developing a cohesive society with tolerance of difference would be a point for the future. We were very fortunate that we had a leader in Mandela who looked forward towards never again to racism. I happen to be in Bolivia. I'm tying this with history, how we can abuse history. And so I sat on the podium, and they reenacted what happened 200 years ago in Bolivia, where the Spanish drew and quartered. So they had this freedom fighter with 2 horses pulling him this side and 2 until his body ripped apart. So they reenact that with the cloth door, and all the speeches where we have to do to them what they did to us. And I thought, oh, that is really abusing history. So remember, take your history, what you've learned, and move forward with it by protecting and promoting the human rights of all persons. Thank you.
Lovely. Please give it up to Morten and to Navi. Thank you.